In this video, we're going to talk about illumination. And to do that, we're going to apply a material to our speaker housing. So we're going to go to appearances and we need to select an appearance to apply. I'm going to start with a high gloss white plastic and then move to my illumination tab. From the illumination tab, I have dynamic help turned on and we can take a look at some of the things that we can manipulate. The first of which is the diffuse amount. Now, this is a value from 0 to 1, 1 being the highest value, which makes the surface appear brighter. Lower this value, our surface is going to appear darker. So, what's happening is it's actually absorbing the light rather than reflecting it and appearing brighter. Now, for a case like this, we want to keep this value all the way up at 1 because we want the actual appearance of our part to be fairly bright. Otherwise, we wouldn't have selected a high gloss white plastic. The next thing is the specular amount. Even though we have control over this value, it's not really going to do anything for this material. We have a value that goes from 0 to 1, or essentially very close to 0 to 1. You drag the slider all the way to the left, it's not actually going to be at 0. When we look at what happens with specular, it's actually going to be the reflection of highlights within the specular component. Now, what this means, if you think of paint on a car, a lot of times, even if you have a black paint, you might have silver flecks in that paint. Now, those are going to be the specular accents or the specular colors. If we go back to our color image section, notice that there's only a single dominant color here. If instead we choose an appearance such as painted, car, and let's pick a white paint here, we'll notice that we have a dominant color and then we have a secondary color. The secondary color is actually going to be the specular color. If we select a different painted car color, such as metallic gray or even metallic gold, you'll notice that these have two different colors for the dominant and the secondary. Now, what this is telling me is that when light is applied to it, we're going to see a lighter section here. With a color like white, we don't actually have that value there. We only have the white color. So it's important to understand that if you're going to be modifying specular spread, then it needs to be on a color that actually can use it. For the purposes of this specific video on illumination, we're going to go ahead and use this sienna painted car material. That way we actually have a primary or a dominant and a secondary color. And that'll allow us to manipulate the specular color. So you'll notice that this is actually a third color here, and the specular amount and the diffuse amount have actually changed from the values of our high gloss plastic. So instead of a value of 1, we now have a value of zero point 0.8. And for specular, instead of a value of zero point 0.5, we now have a value of 0.35. This gives us a good base to start manipulating these values. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to change the specular color to something that is a little bit more apparent, such as yellow. And then with the specular amount, I'm going to go ahead and increase this value. And let's go ahead and look at a preview. So as we create a preview render, you'll notice that the reflections or the light areas are yellow here, but this isn't the result that we're looking for. And there's a good reason why. In order to have a specular spread, we actually need to have a light or a spotlight applied. If we go to the lights in the scene, directional 5 and directional 6, you'll notice that they're in the SOLIDWORKS light folder, but they're not in the photo view folder. Now, photo view is using this 360 lighting, which is based on a lot of the scenes, or in a Lightbox Studio scene, which means that these directional lights are off. If we right click on them, we can turn them on in photo view 360 and actually show them. From our hide show items area, we can show the lights and see where they are. Now you'll notice that these lights are not really pointing in any area that we're concerned with, so they may or may not even give us a very good result. But let's go ahead and do a preview window and see. As you can see, they're not really shining on our part. Even though we're not technically creating lights in this video, I'm going to go ahead and add a quick spotlight and have that spotlight pointing on our model. So this way we have a good idea of that specular spread. And we want to make sure that it's on in Photo View 360. And I'm going to narrow it down. So now we definitely have a spotlight in our scene, and we should get a good idea of changes we make to the specular spread in the illumination. The reflection here from where the light's hitting it is very crisp because we turned those amounts up and it's yellow. So now we can go back into our material, back into appearances, back into illumination, and let's change it to something a little bit different like green. We'll take the specular amount and we'll drop that back down to a lower value. And you'll also notice that we have a blurriness. I'm going to pull this down so we get a nice crisp value and say OK and do another preview. So this time we should see a green reflection for that specular value. Even though we have an orange amount here, you can see that it's really more of a green color now. Let's do one last change to this illumination and let's make it something different. Let's make it purple. Let's take this specular amount and let's crank it back up. You'll also notice that we have luminous intensity and transparency. We're not going to make our part transparent. This is really something that you deal with when you're talking about opacity, things that you want to see through. 100% is completely transparent. And most of the time, you're going to be dealing in the 50 to 75 range for things that you want to see through, but still obscure and get a nice render. Luminous intensity is something that is actually going to omit light. So if you have a light bulb, if you have an LED, that value is typically going to be about 1.5 to 2, and it's actually going to omit light rather than just being a shiny object that can reflect light. So let's go ahead, OK this, do one last preview, and take a look at the changes we made. So now you can see that this specular spread here is now purple. That's the color that we changed it to. This is a good way that you can tweak and manipulate values. And of course, you can actually change the color of the light as well. But this is really something that's embedded or ingrained in the material that we're dealing with. For this specific part, what I'm actually going to do is change the appearance to a medium gloss white plastic. Medium gloss white plastic doesn't carry over any of those illumination values that we changed. And as you can see, it only has a single dominant color. But for now, this is the material that we're going to use in our current part.